This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. My guest today is Jungian analyst John Todd. Dr. Todd received a Ph.D. in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute and a diploma in Analytical Psychology, which is the degree of a Jungian analyst, from the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts in North America. He has been in the mental health field for over 23 years. A native of Florida, he began his career spending over a decade as a children and families counselor for Hospice of the Florida Suncoast before beginning his private practice in Evergreen, Colorado in 2006. In addition to being a nationally certified licensed professional counselor, Dr. Todd is a member of the International Association of Analytical Psychology and is currently on the board of the C.G. Jung Institute of Colorado. His paper, The Shadow of the Bat, was our focus today and will be published by Psychological Perspectives this summer. This talk was recorded on May 27, 2016, through the magic of Skype. Dr. Todd, you and I actually met last fall, at a conference here in Chicago that was for the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, and we spoke a little bit about your writings on bats.
It's true.
Yeah, but first, tell us about the path that you took to become a Jungian analyst.
Well, I can easily say that I can blame my wife for this, that when I was, I believe, either 18 or 19, my wife was my girlfriend at the time, happened to be taking a course on called The Transformation of Myth Through Time. That was a Joseph Campbell television course. And I would often, because I wanted to spend time with her, just sit and watch these Campbell lectures with her. Excuse me. And oftentimes he would kind of begin his lecture when he was explaining whatever he was explaining with a little intro to Jung. He would give little diagrams about the psyche and, just the kind of Jung's general map of the psyche. And I was so incredibly moved and excited by the Campbell material that I knew that whatever I did after I graduated from college had to do something, had to be connected to that material, because I wanted to feel like that all the time. And that feeling of just excitement and enthusiasm about the mythological material he was presenting. And as I graduated, I just knew that I wanted to be an analyst. And I believe by the time I was, 20, I think it was 25 or so, that I had graduated and got licensed to be, a therapist. And I was certain that I wanted to be an analyst. And so I, in my naivete, I called up the closest institute and spoke to the president of that institute and just wanted to begin my training. And he honestly wasn't that kind at the time, but he essentially said, "Oh, little boy, you have a lot of work to do before you can be an analyst." And,
oh no, you said wasn't that kind at the time?
Well, he was right.
Okay.
He was a little blunt, shall we say?
Yeah. All right.
But he was right. I mean, I and my, my 25-year-oldness and my excitement and enthusiasm, I just knew that's what I wanted to do, and did not understand the depth of the work and training, both personal and professional training that it takes to be an analyst. And so I was so angry by him saying, come back in about 10 years or so, that I thought, I won't repeat what I thought. There probably is.
Oh, please do. Feel free.
Expletive laden,
yes, I'm sure.
Response to his response to me, but I immediately knew I couldn't wait 10 years, and so I, long story short, I found Pacifica, which is a graduate institute in California that the focus generally is on Jung and so a little bit on Hellman as well, or a lot on Hellman actually, but So I began, not long after that, I began working towards my PhD in depth psychology via Pacifica.
So let me just interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
But at that point, you had your master's degree in counseling and
Yes.
psychology, right?
Yes. Hmm.
And then you're referring to the Pacifica Graduate Institute. And
Yes.
is that
Yes.
in Santa Barbara?
It is. Well, it's actually just outside of Santa Barbara, a town called Carpinteria.
And they offer a PhD program in depth psychology.
They do, and also masters, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken, as well.
Right. And so you entered that program.
Well, I did, and it was incredibly important for my development as an analyst because my master's program was just your basic master's program, which was taught me many important foundational kind of things. But like many programs, really, I think they may have mentioned Jung in passing at best.
Right. Right.
And so it was really important that I did go and have this foundation kind of fortified, shall we say. I
Okay.
had done a lot of my own work, but certainly the intense and in-depth work I did at Pacifica helped me have a better grasp on, the theory itself. And probably within weeks of me finishing my coursework, I applied to a training program to become an analyst.
So, how long did that take after you acquire your master's degree? How long was the PhD program?
It was the actual coursework was, I believe, like 3.5 years.
Hmm.
And then after that, I think I took, boy, I have to guess here, but I'm guessing I took about 2 years to actually finish my dissertation.
Oh, wow.
Because it's a very, at least it was for me, it was a very long and in-depth process. And I was doing that while working full time and, being, a father of two and a husband. And it was a labor of love, or I
Yes,
wouldn't have been able to do it.
a very large commitment. And at that time, had you had any personal analysis?
Well, um, I began. I had had therapy before because Pacifica actually required that I had so many hours with a Jungian oriented therapist. So I'd had some work that was, I would say, Jungian oriented. But when I entered into, and it was interesting that I began my writing my dissertation and began my analytical training and analysis when I began writing my dissertation, and so I had to shift to an actual analyst, and that was the first time that I had an experience, with an actual analyst.
So, yeah, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that because that's come up. This podcast, I decided I wanted it to be unique. I wanted to only interview Jungian analysts. And, I've gotten a lot of flack about that. And you're the first analyst I've interviewed that went to Pacifica. And I'd like for you to explain to us just a little bit about just sort of how it differs from other PhD programs as far as you called it Jungian oriented. And I think that there's a little bit of confusion out there as to the difference between a Jungian oriented therapist and a
Hmm.
Jungian analyst,
Sure.
and just what exactly is required to become a Jungian analyst, which is actual Jungian analysis. And I've actually had some clinicians contact me and want to be interviewed for this podcast that weren't Jungian analysts. And,
Hmm.
I'm not trying to be a snob. I just
Hmm.
want to focus on actual Jungian analysts and Jungian analysis. So, would you explain a little bit about Pacifica and then your training with the IRSJA?
Well, I can certainly tell you my experience with Pacifica. I can't talk about Pacifica broadly, but my experience with Pacifica was incredible, and it was Jungian based, but there were many say post Jungians, so like James Hillman, who were focused on, and it was incredible material and really an essential part of my path to being an analyst. And as what they required was, a certain amount of hours of therapy with a Jungian-oriented, a therapist, and the therapist that I went to was just fine.
Now, we're just talking about you getting your Ph.D. We're not yet
Right.
at you getting your diploma in analytical psychology.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, the difference is that when I moved into analytical training, it was a profound shift in focus, meaning it wasn't just my the focus on my understanding of Jungian theory, which is certainly an important thing. So much of my analytical training was that in addition to my personal analysis. So I had to have hundreds of hours of, literally hundreds of hours of personal analysis. The requirement at Pacifica was much smaller, and honestly, I'm blanking on how much they require, but it really was pretty small relative to the hundreds of hours that I had to be in training. In my personal analysis, and also hundreds of hours of supervision with an analyst. And what that means is that I would take my work that I'm doing with my analysands and take it to a seasoned analyst who has had many years experience with this work and working the material with that analyst, and that whoever that supervisor was, helping me fine tune my understanding of the unconscious as it was presented within that case, how I could understand what was happening, not just within, not just with my analysand, but also within myself, because this isn't just. Then that's one of the wonderful things about Jungian work, is that this isn't just about me sitting and across from an analysand and analyzing them and sharing information. I'm in it with them, and what I mean by that is that there is a field that is created between the two of us, a connection that is created between the two of us that affects both of us.
Yes.
And it's that understanding of how not just what's going on with the analysand and his or her issues or wounds or their path, but also how we affect each other. The deepening of my understanding and of my work, both personally and clinically, I don't even have words for, and it's a grueling process to become an analyst. But once you've made it through to the other side, so to speak, you're a transformed person. And it doesn't mean that all your work is done and you all of a sudden are this enlightened being. I'm not in any way trying to insinuate that, but because the work is always there, and there's always grist for the mill. But
yes,
but it's certainly a transformative, and I would even say initiatory experience. At least mine was. That's for sure.
So that was about 7 years between you receiving your PhD and you receiving your diploma in analytical psychology.
I think it may have even been longer than that.
Longer than that, yeah.
I think so. Well, that's part of also what makes my path maybe a little more unique is that I started so young, that most of the people that I was in training with were much older than me. And so I began training when I was 31, 32. And most people that I was in training with were at least in their mid to late 40s. And so it's a little unusual that someone would begin that early.
Yeah, I began early too. And I'm not an analyst, but I had a long analysis. And I started when I was very young. And I know that Jung's psychology is sometimes referred to as the psychology of the second half of life.
Yes.
And I was definitely not in the second half of my life when I began analysis. So I can relate to that a little bit. And would you say it's for all ages?
Certainly. I mean, while I will say that there's no question that so much of his work did have to do with kind of life after 40, so to speak. there's no question that, that either being in the study of this work or being in analysis saved my life in many ways. That I don't know who I would.
Yes.
I needed that. I personally needed that container, the container of Jung's theory, Jung's ideas, and eventually my analysis that has helped and continues to help me to heal as a human being.
Very well said, and I can definitely relate to that. So this leads me to asking you about your paper, which was your thesis for analytical training. And every analyst has one, their unique take on a subject that's, I don't know, maybe numinous for them. Mm-hmm. And yours was bats. So before you tell us about that paper, which I actually had the chance to read, and it will be published in Psychological Perspectives, the Jungian journal, coming up here soon. In the beginning, you relate how as far back as you could remember, you were drawn to the mysterious, and that even as early as first grade trips to the library, that you say your curiosity drew you to books on the paranormal, the occult, Bigfoot, UFOs, and mythology or folklore about monsters. And, that really got my attention because of my own lifelong interest in those things. And, my first love is actually paranormal radio, which is typically a late night radio. And it was Art Bell. And now it shows like Beyond the Strange, The Mind's Eye, and my favorite, which is End of Days Radio. And I've actually had the opportunity to be on all three of those to talk about Jung's interest in the occult. And, I don't always get a positive response from outsiders about that, but it's very important to me because my interest in those things may have been what drew me to Jung. And I didn't put those two things together until I read your paper. So why did you say that you wrote, given my proclivity to be drawn toward the unknown, it fits that as an adult, I would find myself studying the psychology of C.G. Jung and working with the unconscious?
Well, all that's true. I mean, very clearly from a very young age, that's where my interests were drawn to, and I could not get enough of that material. And my, at least, interpretation of that has been, that the unknown has always, especially as a little guy, that the unknown was equal parts fascinating and alluring, and scary and terrifying. And certainly as I grew older, that did not change, and it became a little less scary. But certainly the allure to the unknown has always been there, and it still is. It still is to this day, and that's part of why I believe that so much of my personal and professional work has to do with the unconscious, which is the unknown realm of our psyche. Even if we're not talking about literal ghosts or literal monsters, which we could also talk about those as well, but all those creatures are alive and well in our psyche, and certainly I can remember not long ago, maybe like a year ago or so, I began working with a client who came to me because she's dealing with some pretty severe trauma in her past. Sent me an email, and and she laughed. She laughed when it was a ha 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 kind of email at the end, but it didn't seem so funny. She sent me this little cartoon about what analysis was like, and it was these people walking through a haunted house. And wow. you saw people walking in the cartoon. It was like a Far Side type cartoon where people were walking into the haunted house and then walking out looking a little disheveled and frightened. And she, literally said, this is what going to an appointment with you is like. And, at the end, ha ha ha. But then when we processed it clearly, she feels exactly how she feels, that there are ghosts that she clearly is haunted by, and and that's not so funny. But it was uh, an important point for us to sit with in analysis. What in analysis was her owning just how terrifying um, uh, the so-called ghosts in her psyche are to her. Does
Let
that
me
make any
just
sense?
let me just interrupt you there. So I've had people ask me this before. Would you say that when somebody sees a ghost or believes that they have been haunted for a period of time, that it's an actual entity outside of themselves, or is it always an inner figure that's being projected?
Um, that I cannot answer. What I can say is what I think is that if I've had more than one person come in and say that they're being haunted, literally, and my approach is always, I've personally never experienced a ghost, at least outside of my psyche. I've certainly been haunted by a complex or two, but I am open as a human, just as a human being, I'm open to that being a reality, that there are ghosts. Just because I haven't experienced one doesn't mean that, there aren't ghosts out there, at least that's what I believe. But whenever someone comes in, I will ask them about this from a literal perspective and try to understand it. And then I'll also ask about the metaphor and the symbolic perspective, which means, what that person be haunted by. And it's almost always fruitful to do both, because I would say there are very few of us who have not had the experience of being haunted by something psychologically.
I see.
And to me, it's the wonder and the awe of the unknown, and truly knowing that is like I said with ghosts. Are there ghosts? I'm certainly open to that, even though I've never experienced it. But are we haunted? And can life feel like you're living in a haunted house sometimes? Most certainly. And to have the honor of walking with someone, down their path and help them maybe exercise their demons, so to speak, or have a clearing of their psychological space to get rid of those ghosts, is a truly an honor. And to be able to, to make a living and doing this, and to be asked into someone's personal space, like that psychological sacred space, really,
Right.
and trusted to do so is a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah. You wrote about a dream that you had about a bat ear
Oh, right.
that was slightly singed on the outer edge. And you brought that dream to your analyst. But what we haven't covered yet is how and when bats entered your life.
I recall dreaming about bats at least all of my adult life, and I certainly had experiences with bats, as a younger person, but they were literal bats. My interest, particularly symbolically speaking, really peaked when I began my first analysis. And it's interesting that whenever an analysis is begun, you'll often hear analysts talk about that first dream, and that first dream can often it's almost as if the psyche is giving us the map of the territory that we need to walk into, and or kind of give us a little bit of a hint about where it is we need to go.
Yeah, and I just want to interrupt you there. I'd like to give the heads up to anybody who's interested in beginning analysis in the future. I didn't know about this. I didn't record a dream to bring to my analyst for my first session. So heads up to everybody out there who's planning on entering analysis. Write down that first dream, because I have no idea what mine was, and I'll never know.
Well, and it's called an initial dream, and it's a real if analysts are talking among themselves, or trying to work on a case together, they'll often say, "Well, what was the initial dream?" And I'm pretty sure that if this wasn't the very first, it was among the first. My analyst, her name was or is Kathy Mays, a wonderful analyst, and the dream was that Kathy was standing in the room, my son's bedroom, and my son at the time was, I believe, around 2 years old, and she was holding his hand, and it was a birthday party, and she had it was kind of a cute image, because she was holding a piece of birthday cake like you would at a birthday party, and she was standing there, and it was a very kind of nice image, and the thing that stood out was she had one human ear and one gigantic bat ear, and it was a very tall. And it's interesting, and this is what I love about the psyche, is that my way of working with images and in dreams in general is that I believe there's intention there in some way from the psyche, that of all the animal ears that she could have had, it wasn't a cat ear, and it wasn't a dog ear, it was a bat ear. And of all bat ears, it was a very big, exaggerated bat ear, which is from a particular bat. And so as I entered into the image, and this is just my way of working, not everyone works with images this way,
okay.
But I paid attention to not just that this was a bat ear, but eventually I went, oh my gosh, that's this kind of bat. It's not a vampire bat, and it's not a this kind of bat. It's not a that, it's a this. But the bat ear was pretty exaggerated, and it had, on the very tips of it, was just singed a little bit. And I can still remember taking it to Kathy and sitting down and saying, I had the funniest dream. And when I shared it with her, she just kind of smiled and nodded, and she said, "You've picked up on my wound." Which was Kathy's way is to be a rather warm and open person. And in the Jungian world, oftentimes what we call this is an image of our inner analyst. And so, in other words, this simultaneously was an image of Kathy, and my psyche was telling me about Kathy. Because she said, "You picked up on my wound," which means that on an unconscious level, that my unconscious picked up on her wound, and said, "Oh, look, there it is."
You're saying her actual wound, she as a person.
Yes, exactly. Her wounding that she experienced throughout her lifetime was represented to me in this image of the bat ear that was singed.
So now, how would you explain to everybody listening that your unconscious picked up on something in somebody else's unconscious that you had no prior knowledge of and no way of knowing? How is that possible?
Well, we kind of talked about this a minute ago. It's the sense that when two people, are sitting together in this work, that they create this field together. And so what that means is the two of us sit there and are connected in a way. And our egos on one level, meaning our conscious selves, are talking. And so what I often say to analysts is that my ego thinks, as an experienced professional, my ego thinks, oh, I'm hearing these things about her history, or these things about his wounds or whatever. And my ego thinks, oh, this is the path we need to take.
Okay.
Or this is, what we need to do to address this person's issues. And not to say that ego perspective isn't important, because it most certainly is. However, what's more important to me is what the unconscious has to say. So I might, with that analysis, say, okay, well, let's take this path, and we walk down this path together that consciously I think as a professional we need to take. And then her dream can't come up and say, "Oh, no, 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 no! I think this is what we need to this is what we need to address," or "This is really the problem," or "You kind of missed it. This is the issue."
Right.
And so the unconscious is constantly compensating for the one-sidedness of the ego. And so, in my experience with my analyst, sitting there with her, and I am a more certainly a more intuitive person. So sitting there together, it's not just our egos that are connecting; our unconscious selves are kind of communicating as well, sort of underneath, so to speak.
Okay.
And so when I had that dream, it was my unconscious simultaneously telling me about Kathy, my analyst, but also it was reflective of my own inner analyst, meaning there's the simplest way I know to say this is there's something in me, but the best way the psyche knew to represent it was Kathy. And if it wasn't, if Kathy wasn't the best representation of this, it would have shown up some other way.
Okay, so would you say that you are everyone in your dream? That it's not just about Kathy, it's about the Kathy in you? That Kathy is you in that dream?
Well, there's certainly many paths to understanding dreams, and the one that I am most fond of, really, and feel like is the best one, at least for the work that I do, is that at the very least, what I would always consider is that every person in the dream is reflective of some part of me. But that does not mean that it doesn't have a literal interpretation. So in other words, oftentimes, and it's not always this way, but oftentimes, let's say if I have a dream about my wife, that we are so close, that my dream most likely is true of her. It's probably telling me something about her, but at the same time, it's also telling me something about me.
What part of you would that be, your wife, in you?
Well, classically speaking, she would be an image of my anima. And in the Jungian world, the anima for a man is my so-called feminine side. Mm-hmm. And Jung said that women have something that's similar, that is their animus, which is their so-called masculine side. And that can get a little tricky because this theory was developed by a white Swiss man in their early 1900s, and so there's there are many gender just gender issues that I would say are not addressed then, because he was, poor guy, he was doing the best he could in the 1900s, right? And the best he could wasn't so bad. So the animus issue is a kind of a little bit of a controversial one, and many Jungians think that it's not applicable to today, and I kind of sit on the fence with that, because I think he was onto something. Do I think it needs to be broadened and kind of transformed a bit to fit today's understanding of gender? Of course, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sure. And so after you relate the dream in your paper, you said something so interesting. You said, as is so often the case with analysts and analysans, we shared a similar wound.
It's true. I mean, I wouldn't say this is true 100% of the time, but it's not uncommon for the analysans who show up at my door to have a similar wound, or at least our wounds are in the same ballpark, so to speak. And so I would say that the image that was presented to me with the bat ear dream was, it's showing the capacity to hear what, because bats have this amazing ability to, not only do they have this particular bat, this ear that was presented, this particular bat not only has the capacity for echolocation, which means that it sends out a sound, a little click that we can't even hear. And then when that sound bounces back, it forms an image in its brain of its environment. So that's how it can see in the dark. And so it's already giving us an image of being able to see in the dark. So if you interpret that, the metaphor is that the analyst has the capacity to see in the unconscious, so the dark, where others may perhaps not be able to see. But this particular bat not only can do the echolocation, really has little to do with their hearing, so to speak, but it also has hearing so fine-tuned that it can literally hear the wind made by a moth's wings. So that's some pretty darn good hearing. And so the image that was presented to me was that capacity being, the singed, wounded a little bit. And so as an analyst, Kathy, I'm sure, was looking at, oh, there's his wound. And not just there's her wound, but here's his as well. And of course, she's holding my son, who was 2 years old at the time, his hand. So there's little me, right? And there's big me in the dream, the ego, and there's little me. And so, and there's an image of my inner analyst, so to speak, and the inner analyst would be my capacity inwardly to understand my unconscious, which would be whatever surfaces for my unconscious could be feelings, could be intuitions, could be sensations, just understanding my deeper self.
So would you say a little bit about your childhood experience with them?
Are you speaking about the island experience I wrote about?
Yeah, anything that would kind of show us that this has been with you for a really long time, and how I don't know, whatever word you would use, your fascination with bats or your interest in them, or how they kept, popping up in your life, how that was a part of the work that you did as an adult, and how you exploring the outer world of bats taught you something about yourself.
Certainly after that dream that I had, with the bat ear, I was paying more and more attention. Well, what does that mean?
Right.
And what does that reflect for me? And the thing that really kind of caught me and caught my curiosity was, to this day, and maybe I still dream about bats, and so it's not that has not stopped. But I've yet to have a dream that was negative. And so the image of the bat was showing up to me in these really positive ways. And it seemed to really kind of clash with our general cultural experience of bats, which is pretty negative.
Yeah, because you point out that bats are associated with darkness and evil.
Oh, indeed. And that's the thing, is that my dreams were coming to, they were coming to my dreams, and they were positive. And I was honestly kind of perplexed. Thinking about the literal bat, I never quite got why people didn't. I get it. Some of them are really unusual looking and kind of, look like little gargoyles, and so I can get that they're not.
They are. I mean, Dr. Todd, they are kind of creepy. I'm sorry.
Well, no, but I know I get that. I mean, on some of them are almost bordering on grotesque.
Yes.
And yet, at the same time, I never had that revulsion to them. And so I was perplexed, not only to understand me, but to understand the cultural experience. What was going on? So it was like this. It was a combination of trying to understand myself and trying to understand that revulsion that people have.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, I said that they are associated with darkness and evil, and that is specifically in our Western culture. That's not all over or throughout time.
Oh my goodness, no. That was what was fascinating, was I started to dig into mythology and folklore around bats, and I would say majority of the stories, fairy tales, etc.,
right,
about bats pre the Judeo-Christian era were not just positive; they were really positive. And it was interesting that I had this phenomenal synchronistic experience that I had started to dig into this material, and I had gone with my family My wife and kids and I were at the zoo in Tampa, Florida, where I grew up, and I actually live in Colorado now, but we were visiting. And we went into this little aviary type section of the zoo that had animals and birds from Australia. So there was kookaburras and, kangaroos, etc. And they also had some bats, and you could see them hanging kind of in the corner of the aviary. And there was a little cartoon that was a little plaque cartoon in front of the window. And it said, there were two figures speaking to each other. And one of them said, "Ooh, ick, bats are scary, or bats are gross." And the other character says, "Oh, but bats are an incredibly important part of our ecosystem. And they provide all these things for our ecosystem that are essential. And if we didn't have bats, we wouldn't have." And it listed all the things. And it said, in fact, the spelling of this is Joongians, the Jungian tribe. Right. The Jungian tribe in Australia saw bats as sacred and a god that taught them how to be human. And I was sitting there thinking, no way. And so I wrote this down. I wrote this down on my phone. I typed a little note on my phone and spelled it, because I thought I'm going to forget the spelling. So I got the spelling, and I went home, and I did the first thing that all scholars do for serious scholarly research. I went to Google, and I Googled this word and found nothing. And I thought, oh, come on. I'm not making this up. So I probably went 5 or 6 pages deep into Google, and I found a obscure little reference in an article from an Australian psychological journal, not psychological, it's anthropological journal. And I thought, okay, I didn't make this up. And I contacted the university, and they were nice enough to give me an article, and actually sent me several PDFs of these journals about tribes that found, and the reason I couldn't find it was because the zoo had spelled it wrong.
Oh, okay.
Right. And even though it is Jungian, I forget the actual spelling, but it was something close. And I thought there was an interesting synchronicity that it would sound so much like Jungian. But the story that came from that article was a fascinating image of the Lightbringer. And the Lightbringer is an archetype and kind of a mythological motif of a figure or a character in a story bringing light, meaning bringing consciousness. You'll see, if you look into the image of the Lightbringer, that the Lightbringer is an essential figure in the formation or the coming to consciousness. And so consciousness oftentimes is seen or reflected in the image of light. And so you can imagine if you say something dawned on me, or and what that means is I became aware of something. So I became conscious of something.
So by consciousness, do you mean awareness, knowledge? What do you mean?
Well, if you compare it to being unconscious, so if you're unconscious of something, you're unaware. It's something that you and others may see it in you, but you're certainly unaware of this aspect of yourself, say. And the Lightbringer would bring the light, so to speak, bring the awareness, bring the consciousness of whatever this is to your attention.
To sort of shine a light on it, so you can see.
Indeed. And the story was the story of the Munmundi celebration, which is, all the animal tribes gathered together, and they were having a big party, and all of a sudden arguments start to break out. And this tribe says, well, my fur is much softer than your fur. And the, birds say, well, my feathers are even prettier than your fur. And there was all this kind of arguing and lack of humility, shall we say. And the creator spirit was so disgusted with them that he said, I'm done with you. I'm going to punish you by turning the lights out. and takes the sun away. And of course, everything falls into darkness, and the animals are distraught and they're repentant, but it doesn't matter. Their creator God is not going to have it. And so each tribe is asked, that they asked the kangaroos, can you find the light? The kangaroos couldn't find the light. They asked the owl, can you find the light? The owl can't find the light. And finally, they make it to the lowly bat. And the bat has a boomerang. And the bat throws the boomerang to the south, and the boomerang goes out and comes back, and there's nothing there. And throws it to the west, goes out, comes back, nothing there. And throws it to the east, and all of a sudden, wow, something comes back, and it's light. And of course, the sun rises in the east. And the other animals ask the bat, what are you doing? And the bat says, I am dividing the darkness from the light. And first of all, it's a wonderful image of echolocation. And I'm not saying in any way that the Aboriginal folks who told this story were aware of echolocation. Maybe they were. But imagine that, it's a perfect image of throwing a sound out. So the boomerang is thrown out, and then it comes back. And that's exactly what happens in echolocation. They throw a sound out, the sound comes back, and it's almost as if on an unconscious level that these, native folks had understood what was happening. And it's also certainly an image of the light bringer. And if you imagine people living in darkness, in the dimness of, maybe evolving from being more, living with more of an animal type consciousness to becoming more aware and having more of that human consciousness, that light is certainly a big deal. Consciousness is certainly a big deal. And certainly if you don't have electricity and light bulbs, that light's an even bigger deal. And so the light bringer to these people, of course, was sacred. How could the light bringer not be sacred? And so for an animal and their environment, for them to see an animal in their environment that has the capacity to see in the dark, I would imagine they would value that capacity and hold it sacred as well.
You also talk about how the bat is associated with the shadow and with vampires. So none of that says to me that the bat is the light bringer. So how did this distortion happen?
Well, I don't know that I would call it a distortion, because it's every archetype, every image has a positive and negative pole. And the word that's often used for it is polyvalent, which means it has a potential to be positive and negative, and really everything in between. And so if you imagine that on the positive end of the spectrum, you have the image of the light bringer. And with the early people's mythologies, oftentimes, even like many South American tribes, the word for bat, butterfly, and hummingbird, it was either the same or very similar, because it was an image of, or it was an animal to them that pollinated many plants, right? And an image of this essential part of their lives that, because if the plants don't get pollinated, then there's a problem and there's no food. And so here you have an animal and an image that is associated with seeing in the dark, that's seen as connected to fecundity and pollination. And even there are many bats that are insectivorous, meaning that they only eat insects, and particularly the insects that kill our crops. And so the literal bat was really important to these folks, and it worked its way into their mythology as something that was equally important. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are bats, and interestingly, I think there are something like over 1,200 species of bats, and I think 3 or 4 of them are vampiric. So an extremely small number of bats are actually parasitic, that would drink your blood. But they do exist. And so on the other end of the spectrum is, the image of that kind of vampiric creature. And so if you what I found is that if you started to see it as not as a metaphor for the contents of the unconscious, so to speak, or at least a relationship with the unconscious, that are there complexes that can feed on us? Oh, most certainly. And what I mean by feed on us is that there's a limited amount of libido or psychological energy available to us within the kind of, within our ecosystem, our inner ecosystem, so to speak. And if a complex overcomes the ego and takes all that libido from the ego that would normally be just at the ego's disposal, all of a sudden the ego probably goes unconscious and the complex takes over, but the complex dies if you don't feed it, so to speak. If you don't give it the libido.
Would you define libido in this sense? Because I think that we think of libido as something sexual.
Well, that's more the Freudian take, but that's the Jungian take is libido is just the energy, the psychological, almost like flow of energy that is available to us, and we only have so much. So, for instance, if I know that if I'm sick or if I'm tired, and my energy is really low, then it's more likely a complex is going to come knocking at the door, so to speak. And so I don't have the energy to fight off that complex. And so I think we've all had the experience of, maybe being tired or sick and getting grumpy, and maybe saying something, snarky or with an edge that maybe you wouldn't normally say, or falling into a complex or two that normally you wouldn't fall into because you have the energy to fight it off. Does that make sense? And if you imagine that on one end of the spectrum, we have the image of the bat that could be vampiric. So there's, a complex that could, a content of the unconscious that could not be friendly, right? But you also have the other end of the spectrum that if you're at least working towards having a good relationship with the unconscious, the bat is bringing you, so to speak, light. He's bringing you consciousness. So the unconscious can, usually it's not this black or white, but usually if you're working towards, a connection with your unconscious, meaning through dreams or, the many ways that we connect with the unconscious, through analysis or whatever it is, then oftentimes we're not, it doesn't mean we don't have complexes. It means we have probably a better understanding of them, and our dreams will most likely help us to hopefully heal and resolve them. So it goes from being, something that the unconscious can't be trusted because it's feeding on you, to the unconscious must be trusted because it's the thing that is guiding you out of the dark, so to speak, like the light bringer. And so, when you think about what I did in my paper was I started thinking about all the things that people typically say about bats that are negative. So the first one I think was blind as a bat. And so when you think about that, I'm sure we've all heard that phrase many times, and it turns out that's not true. So we have an image that already we know is not factual, and so we're projecting something on this bat. Most bats have their eyesight is just as good, if not better, than our own. So already, we have an image of, is this just projection, right? And so I moved to another one, which was a bat's flight is chaotic. And so people often experience when they see bats flying around, they appear, and I can understand that because I've certainly seen many bats flying around, and they can look chaotic. And when I really started to do research on that, it turns out, I believe in 2008, they have for forever, when they've studied bats, they've seen this microscopic coating of hair on their body that they couldn't figure out what it was there for. And just in 2008, they finally figured out what it was. And it's these microscopic hairs that give them, this is beyond echolocation, that give them this extremely fine-tuned awareness of their environment, so they can pick up on the air temperature, the shift in, the direction of the wind, and et cetera, et cetera. And literally, the word they used in the scientific journal was that it gives the bat an intuitive flight response. So, and what they were saying was that it looks as if the bat is responding to something that we as humans, it's so far beyond our perception that it may look chaotic, but what we perceive as chaotic is actually precision. And it's interesting that the scientists would use the word intuitive and perception beyond what our eyes see. And so what Jung said intuitive was, or how he defined intuitive, is perception via the unconscious. And so, in other words, we, not just the bats, but we have the capacity to perceive things that are beyond our vision, beyond our ears, beyond the visual, beyond the auditory, beyond the tactile. We have this perception via the unconscious. And so, already that starts to fill in, what is it that the bat holds for us that we do not trust? Because here we perceive this as chaos when it's actually precision. And I would say the same thing about the unconscious, that oftentimes people are so at odds with their unconscious, or even at war with their unconscious, that when they get kind of an intuitive hit, so to speak, or like a gut feeling, or they pick up on something that they don't understand, they can easily brush it off. And what to the average person may feel like, oh, that's nothing, or that's crazy, or that's whatever, it can actually be precision, much like the bat. Does that make any sense?
Yes. You've also referred to bats as psychopomps. What is a psychopomp?
Well, it's very similar to the idea of the light bringer. So the psychopomp is also, it's known as the guide of souls, and so the psychopomp can show up as a human figure, and oftentimes one of the most popular ones that probably most people know is Hermes. And Hermes from Greek mythology was that god that could, he was the messenger of the gods, so he could cross that borderline between the human or mortal and God, and bring the messages from the gods to the humans. So again, if you look at that as, or interpret that as, a psychological function, so let's say you see it as the aspect or the part of our psyches that has the capacity to cross over from conscious to unconscious. So, and the more obvious example would be the dream. And so the dream emerges from the unconscious and breaks into consciousness whenever our defenses are down, usually during sleep, and brings us the messages of the gods, so to speak. But again, if you look at that, if you take away the Hermes image and think about the bat, emerging from the cave, right? And in the dark. So when we, the human ego, when we close our eyes at night to go to sleep, the bat is emerging. And so, but think about that metaphorically, that as we close our eyes, the unconscious and our defenses go down in sleep, the unconscious emerges from its cave and brings us the dreams that really have the potential to bring us, healing and wisdom and guidance, hence the psychopomp. And the psychopomp can show up often as a wise man, a wise woman, or an animal.
And the bat is an example of that.
Indeed.
So our talk would not be complete if we don't mention Batman.
All right.
There's a lot to say, I know. You have some history with Batman. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? As much or as little as you'd like, but Batman is definitely significant here.
Well, certainly. And, that's something else that perplexed me about the Western culture's repugnance and kind of being repelled by the bat, is that we really, in general, don't like bats. The average person finds them creepy. But oh my goodness, we'll spend millions of dollars on a man dressed up as a bat.
Right.
And there's
What's
something
that?
exactly that made me really curious. And as I thought about images of the psychopomp, images of the Lightbringer, um, it became clearer and clearer to me that I believe that the image of the bat is almost always connected with the unconscious, and probably reflective of relationship with the unconscious. And so here we have a man who, if you just take the kind of classic story or origin of Batman, has experienced a significant trauma as a child. And, most certainly, um, if we had a literal Bruce Wayne, Batman's alter ego, so to speak, um, it wouldn't be shocking if this fellow didn't need to be an analysis. For goodness sake, his parents died in front of him. And who would not be significantly traumatized by that? But we have this man who has experienced this great trauma, and then in response to it, in many ways, has donned the guise of the bat. And as I started to look at it and I started thinking about that, he sounds a whole lot like a shaman, in the fact that shaman do exactly the same thing, that they don the guise of their animal totem or their animal spirit. And what they're doing is, and it's not this simple, but essentially what they're doing is kind of invoking the powers of that animal that they can, so that they can embody that in their work. And of course, what shaman do is they are the intermediary between the worlds, the spirit world and the human world. And so, of course, we have there a very similar image to the psychopomp and the Lightbringer, that capacity to travel between the worlds and bring healing. And so here we have this man who has donned the guise of the bat, and he's not typically, I mean, it depends on what story you're looking at, but typically not just battling anyone. He's battling the foes that really are beyond the capacity of the police department to handle. So if the police department could handle the Joker or, Two-Face or whoever he's fighting, they really wouldn't need a Batman. But apparently Gotham does. And you could also say that that's very true of the shaman. The shaman is handling what the general tribe cannot handle. And what needs to be done isn't anything that the average person could do. It's this capacity to go back and forth between the worlds. And to me, what I wonder, and this is just because of time, this is the quick version. The quick version is that I believe on some level, I mean, there's certainly could be many interpretations of Batman and revenge fantasies, et cetera, but that feels too simple, and it doesn't appear that people who just take that avenue to interpret him take the time to go underneath and go a little deeper. But what it feels like is it's this longing for our connection or reconnection with our deeper selves, that we long for not just a Batman, but our inner Batman, so to speak. We long for that capacity. We long for the psychopomp. We long for that deeper connection with ourselves. And I think that's what we've lost. And so, certainly we can idealize, early peoples and their connection to nature, and we can really overlook that there's good and bad. That they too experienced good and bad, and they needed to evolve and grow too. But I don't think it's an idealization to say, oh my goodness, we lost something when we became so conscious, so to speak, that we lost our connection to our deeper selves. And in doing so, losing our connection to the world, truly. Um, but it's interesting in the newest Batman film, he has, I believe he has two dreams, maybe three, but there are two that really stand out. And the first one was he is at the bottom of a well, and so he's under the earth in the unconscious, right? And he is literally being lifted, and you can see it's the camera angle is, it's aiming up. So you're seeing the boy being lifted by the bat to the light. So they're, literally bringing him to the light. So it's the perfect image. I was watching this in the theater thinking, oh my gosh, there it is. There's the light bringer. And then later you see an image is rather gruesome, but it's a vampire-like image that he dreams. And so it's very clear that in this telling of the story, he's wrestling with both ends of the archetype. And so often with early peoples, the image of the bat was connected with the feminine. In that shift, from that we had when the Judeo-Christian tradition really came to prominence, from the matriarchal to the patriarchal, the bat changed from that positive, light bringer type image to an image of the demonic. And you see both in that latest Batman versus Superman film. And interestingly, at least my interpretation of the film, what the film pivots on the relationship to the feminine. Literally, the whole film turns. Everything in the film just takes a quick turn in a different direction when the issue of disconnection from the feminine is brought up. So anyway, I won't go off on that path because that's another topic. But
so just real quickly, what is the antidote then?
Antidote to
identifying with the dark side of the bat. And you said that he was struggling with the positive side and the negative side. So what do we do to stop projecting these demonic things onto the bat?
Well, what I would say is, at least in my take on things, is it's about the unconscious. And if we have and it's not, I am not trying in any way to say that the unconscious doesn't have a dark side, because the positive and the negative are all contained within the unconscious. And it's kind of like that idea of having bats in your belfry, right? Can the unconscious overwhelm us? It certainly can. Can we be swallowed up by the unconscious at its worst? Most definitely. And so there we have that negative pole of the archetype. And I'm not trying to in any way, candy coat it or make it all sunshine and butterflies. There's a dark side and there's a light side and there's everything in between. But my personal and professional experience is that the more that we work towards having a healthy and positive relationship with the unconscious, the more that kind of evens out and becomes less extreme. And so we're less likely to be overwhelmed by the unconscious or fed on by those complexes if we become aware of those complexes. If we turn towards the unconscious and form a relationship. It's like having a relationship with this inner other, within us. When that bridge is crossed, when that bridge is built, for goodness sake, all of a sudden, we have this ally at our disposal that will help us to find balance and wholeness. And really, that's so much of what the unconscious, the relationship with the unconscious to consciousness is about compensation and about balance. That the unconscious is always trying to compensate for the one-sidedness of consciousness. And what happens is if we it's almost like it's knocking at the door, knocking at the door, knocking at the door. And if we don't answer, it'll break the door down. And our job is to learn how to, at the very least, listen. And I'm not telling you that every dream that a client comes in with or that I have personally, I understand. I don't. But I'm going to try. Because most of the time, if we dig around enough, we'll find that nugget of gold in the dark. And it's all about listening to those messengers, listening to those psychopomps, to those light bringers, because, in reality, the unconscious is always, some people say, and I believe this to be true, we're always dreaming. The unconscious is always trying to connect with us. It's just that for most of us, whenever we close our eyes and go to sleep, that we have a clearer channel, so to speak, or a clearer connection with the unconscious. But my guess is that the unconscious is always there, trying to show us what we're not seeing.
Yes, thank you. And I think we've found that nugget of gold here with you today, Dr. Todd. Thank you so much. I just want to mention in closing that in June, you're going to be presenting at the first Jung Midnight Sun Conference, Nature, Psyche, and Culture in Fairbanks, Alaska, actually along with our next guest, Lara Newton, and that's from June 24th to 26th. It's hosted by the C.G. Jung Society of Northern Alaska, and you're going to be presenting on the shadow of the bat material.
It's true. And actually, Laura and I will be there. And Laura and I also are often lecture and teach, in the continental U.S., meaning there's a institute, the CGJIC, which is the C.G. Jung Institute of Colorado, where Laura and I both often lecture and teach, in Denver.
That's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to speaking with her next month. So, Dr. Todd, thank you so much for your time today and all of the wonderful information you shared with us. And when your paper is published, I will put a link to that on our website.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. John Todd, for his patience and cooperation, and for how generous he's been with his time. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com for more information about Dr. Todd, as well as links to his upcoming presentations. There you'll also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to listen to or to download for free. This podcast is also available on iTunes, Stitcher, and now on Google Play Music. With gratitude to Sean Lau, Charlie Arthur, and Diane Braden, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.